The morning sun cast gentle shadows across the facade of the Bluebell Hotel, a modest establishment that sat at the curve of the road just outside St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Partridge, the proprietress, took particular pride in her hanging baskets of petunias and the fresh cream paint that gave the former coaching inn an air of genteel respectability. On this Tuesday, in late September, the hotel was pleasantly full with the sort of guests who appreciated quiet countryside and reasonable rates. Miss Jane Marple sat in the small garden, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she worked on a soft blue baby jacket. To any observer, she appeared to be simply enjoying the morning air, but her pale blue eyes missed nothing of the small drama unfolding around her. She had been invited for an extended visit by Mrs. Partridge, an old acquaintance, and found the hotel's guests quite fascinating in their various ways. There was Mr. Pendleton in room 3, a precise man who took his meals at exact times and had complained twice about noise from the room above. The middle-aged Hargreaves couple in room 5 maintained a brittle cheerfulness that suggested recent marital difficulties. Miss Trent, a sensible young woman in tweeds, kept consulting railway timetables with unnecessary frequency. And then there was Mr. Wendell in room 7. Mr. Wendell had arrived 3 days prior, a nervous, thin man with darting eyes and a habit of paying for everything in cash. He had specifically requested the room at the back, claiming he needed quiet for his writing. Yet Mrs. Partridge had confided to Miss Marple that the gentleman spent most nights pacing his floor and had been seen arguing with someone near the garden gate the previous evening. "Most peculiar thing, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Partridge had whispered over breakfast. "Yesterday morning, clear as day, Mr. Wendell told me he'd be checking out this morning. Paid his bill in full, he did. Said he'd be leaving at first light. But when I inquired this morning, he looked at me as if I'd taken leave of my senses. Insisted he'd never said any such thing." Miss Marple had found this quite interesting indeed. In her experience, when people claimed not to remember things they had clearly said, it usually meant they were either lying or genuinely terrified of something. Now, as she sat with her knitting, she observed Mr. Pendleton pacing the terrace with increasing agitation. He checked his pocket watch repeatedly and smoothed his thinning hair, a gesture of vanity that suggested he was expecting someone important. Miss Trent appeared at the hotel entrance, small suitcase in hand, then hesitated and retreated back inside. The Hargreaves were visible through the dining-room window, their breakfast conversation appearing unusually animated. "Excuse me, Miss Marple," came a breathless voice. Young Elsie, the chambermaid, stood wringing her hands. "Mrs. Partridge sent me to ask, have you seen anything odd this morning about—" "Mr. Wendell, I mean?" "Odd in what way, dear?" "Well, it's past 10 o'clock and he hasn't rung for anything. Usually he's very particular about his morning tea. I knocked twice, but there's no answer. Mrs. Partridge is worried about disturbing him, what with him being so strange about his privacy and all." Miss Marple set down her knitting thoughtfully. "Perhaps you should try once more with the master key. He may simply be unwell." Elsie nodded and hurried back inside. Miss Marple watched Mr. Pendleton suddenly stop his pacing and stride purposefully toward the hotel entrance, his patience evidently exhausted. Miss Trent emerged again, this time walking quickly toward the road, as if she had suddenly remembered an urgent appointment. The scream, when it came, was sharp and genuine, the sound of someone discovering something terrible and unexpected. It echoed from the upper floors of the hotel, cutting through the peaceful morning like a knife. Miss Marple carefully placed her knitting in her bag and rose, smoothing her skirt. She had heard such screams before, and they always meant the same thing. Someone had discovered that death had arrived ahead of schedule. As she walked toward the hotel, she reflected that Mr. Wendell had indeed checked out that morning, just as he had promised. The only difficulty was that someone had apparently helped him settle his final bill in a most permanent way. The game, as her dear friend Mr. Holmes might have said, was afoot. The scream had come from young Elsie, and by the time Miss Marple reached the first-floor landing, the girl was slumped against the corridor wall, her face chalk-white and her hands trembling violently. Mrs. Partridge stood in the doorway of room 7, one hand pressed to her throat, staring into the room with the particular stillness that comes with profound shock. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Partridge whispered as she approached. "He's dead. Mr. Wendell is quite dead. I sent Elsie to fetch Dr. Haydock, but I fear it's far too late for any medical assistance." Miss Marple moved carefully past them into the room, her pale blue eyes taking in every detail with the methodical precision of someone who understood that first impressions were often the most valuable. Mr. Wendell sat slumped in the armchair by the window, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his eyes staring sightlessly at the morning light streaming through the curtains. His lips bore a faint bluish tinge that spoke eloquently of his final moments. What struck Miss Marple immediately was the contradiction before her. Mr. Wendell was fully dressed in his brown travelling suit, his shoes polished and ready. His suitcase sat by the door, packed and latched, with his overcoat folded neatly on top. The wardrobe hung open and empty, and his washstand had been cleared of all personal items. Every indication suggested a man prepared for immediate departure. Yet there, on the bedside table, sat an overturned glass, its contents having spilled across the lace doily in a dark stain that was already beginning to dry. Beside it lay a small brown bottle, unmarked and empty. The bed itself remained unslept in, the covers still precisely tucked, as the chambermaid had left them the previous morning. "Most curious," Miss Marple murmured, careful not to disturb anything. "He appears to have been quite ready to leave, yet something prevented his departure." The sound of voices in the corridor announced that word of the tragedy was spreading. Mr. Pendleton appeared first, his usual composure cracking as he took in the scene. His face cycled rapidly through annoyance, shock, and then something that Miss Marple found most interesting, a flicker of calculation quickly suppressed. "Good heavens," he said, his voice carefully modulated. "Is that Mr. Wendell? Has there been some sort of accident?" Before Miss Marple could respond, the Hargreaves materialized behind him, Mrs. Hargreaves clutching her husband's arm with white-knuckled intensity. She was a thin woman with anxious eyes who had clearly applied her morning rouge with a trembling hand. "Arthur, what's all this commotion?" she demanded, then caught sight of the figure in the chair. Oh, my goodness, is he—" "I'm afraid so, my dear," her husband replied, though his own face had gone rather pale. Arthur Hargreaves was a heavy-set man with the florid complexion of someone who enjoyed his port, but now he appeared decidedly unwell. "Best if you don't look, Margaret. These things can be quite distressing." Miss Trent appeared at the end of the corridor, having apparently returned from her morning walk with unusual haste. She approached with the measured steps of someone steeling themselves for bad news, her sensible tweeds and forthright manner providing a stark contrast to Mrs. Hargreaves's theatrical distress. "I heard there was trouble," she said quietly. "Mrs. Partridge sent word to the village. Is it Mr. Wendell?" "You seem remarkably well informed for someone who was out walking," Mr. Pendleton observed with a sharp look. Miss Trent's jaw tightened slightly. "News travels quickly in a small community, Mr. Pendleton, particularly news of this sort." Miss Marple watched these exchanges with growing interest. Each guest's reaction revealed something of their character and, more importantly, something of their relationship, or lack thereof, with the deceased. Mr. Pendleton's attempt to appear detached was undermined by his obvious agitation. The Hargreaves seemed genuinely shocked, yet there was something performative about their distress. Miss Trent's composure was admirable, but her quick return suggested she had been expecting something of this nature. "Did any of you hear anything unusual during the night?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Mr. Wendell appears to have been preparing to leave, just as he told Mrs. Partridge yesterday morning." The silence that followed was most eloquent. Several pairs of eyes found sudden interest in the carpet, the walls, anywhere but Miss Marple's mild, questioning gaze. The arrival of Dr. Haydock, announced by his familiar brisk footsteps on the stairs, came as an obvious relief to the assembled group. Behind him came Sergeant Abel from the market town, looking both important and slightly overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Dr. Haydock said, giving her a brief nod of recognition. "I might have known you'd be in the thick of things. Where's our patient?" "I'm afraid he's beyond your help, Doctor," Miss Marple replied quietly. "Room 7. And I rather think Sergeant Abel will find this case requires more than a simple death certificate." As the doctor and sergeant entered the room, Miss Marple stepped back into the corridor with the guests. The contradiction before them was stark. A man who had paid his bill, packed his bags and prepared for departure, yet who had died in his travelling clothes before he could leave. In her long experience with human nature, Miss Marple knew that such contradictions usually pointed to one thing. Someone had been very determined that Mr. Wendell's departure should be permanently delayed. Dr. Haydock emerged from room 7 some 20 minutes later, his medical bag in hand, and his expression decidedly grim. He beckoned Sergeant Abel aside for what he clearly intended as a private consultation, though Miss Marple, who had positioned herself with her knitting near the window where the morning light was excellent, found herself well placed to observe the doctor's emphatic gestures and the sergeant's increasingly troubled countenance. "Poison. I'd stake my professional reputation on it," Dr. Haydock said, in what he believed was a discreet undertone. "The symptoms are quite unmistakable, that particular cyanosis about the lips, the position of the body, and there's a distinctive bitter almond odour still detectable. I'll need to send samples to the laboratory in the county town for confirmation, but I'd say he ingested something lethal sometime between midnight and 3 this morning." Sergeant Abel pulled out his notebook with the air of a man suddenly confronting a task far beyond his usual duties of settling boundary disputes and the occasional poaching incident. His hands, Miss Marple noted with sympathy, trembled slightly as he licked the pencil tip. "Right then, Doctor. I'll need statements from everyone in the hotel. No one leaves the premises until I've spoken with them all." This pronouncement caused an immediate stir among the assembled guests who had been hovering in the corridor with the peculiar mixture of horror and fascination that sudden death invariably provokes. Mr. Pendleton drew himself up with obvious indignation, his carefully maintained composure cracking for the first time since Miss Marple had observed him. "I beg your pardon, Sergeant, but I have an extremely important business appointment in London this afternoon," he protested, his voice rising. "Surely you cannot expect responsible citizens to be detained on the basis of mere proximity to an unfortunate incident." "I expect full cooperation with a police investigation into a suspicious death, sir," Abel replied with unexpected firmness, apparently drawing strength from his official authority. "Until we determine exactly what happened to Mr. Wendell, everyone stays put." Miss Trent, who had been standing quietly by the landing window, turned with a slight frown creasing her sensible features. "How long might such an investigation take, Sergeant? I have commitments of my own that cannot be easily postponed." There was something in her tone, a careful control that suggested she was working hard to appear merely inconvenienced rather than genuinely alarmed. Mrs. Hargreaves, meanwhile, had gone quite pale beneath her morning rouge, clutching her husband's arm with increasing desperation. "Arthur," she whispered, though her voice carried clearly in the confined space, "this is all too dreadful. A murder, right here in the hotel. We might have been killed in our beds." "Now, Margaret, let's not jump to conclusions," her husband replied, though his own hands trembled as he patted her arm reassuringly. The poor fellow might have taken something himself. These commercial traveller types are often under tremendous strain. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm as she observed each reaction with the careful attention of someone who understood that people's first responses to crisis often revealed more about their character than years of ordinary conversation. Mrs. Partridge had retreated to her office, from which came the sounds of vigorous tea preparation, her invariable response to any domestic catastrophe, great or small. "Perhaps I might mention something that struck me as rather curious," Miss Marple ventured gently, setting down her knitting. "Mr. Wendell told Mrs. Partridge quite distinctly yesterday morning that he would be checking out today. He paid his bill in full, most properly. Yet when she reminded him of this arrangement yesterday evening, he claimed to have no memory of the conversation whatsoever." All eyes turned to her, and she continued in her apologetic manner. "It reminds me so very much of a situation we had in our village some years ago. A gentleman who made very specific arrangements, then denied all knowledge of them the following day. It turned out he had been receiving threats, you see. He was attempting to confuse his movements to throw someone off his trail." Sergeant Abel's pencil hovered over his notebook. "Threats, you say, miss? Did anyone observe Mr. Wendell receiving threatening communications?" Mrs. Partridge appeared in her office doorway, a tea tray balanced in her hands and her face flushed with sudden recollection. "Oh, my goodness, I'd quite forgotten in all the excitement. There was a telegram delivered for him Monday afternoon. When I brought it up to his room, he went white as a sheet after reading it. Burned it in his fireplace immediately, he did. I thought it rather odd at the time, but guests do have their private affairs." "And there was someone at the garden gate Monday evening," Miss Marple added thoughtfully. Mrs. Partridge mentioned hearing raised voices. "I couldn't see who it was clearly," Mrs. Partridge admitted, setting down her tray with a slight clatter. "It was getting dark, and they were standing in the shadows by the old oak tree. But I distinctly heard Mr. Wendell saying something about keeping to the agreement, and the other person, I couldn't tell if it was a man or woman, saying something about running out of time. It went on for several minutes before they separated." Miss Marple noticed with interest how Mr. Pendleton had gone very still during this exchange, his earlier bluster evaporating entirely. Miss Trent's fingers had tightened perceptibly on her handbag, and Arthur Hargreaves had suddenly discovered a fascinating pattern in the corridor carpet that required his complete attention. Each of them, she observed, was taking great care to avoid looking at the others, a sure sign in her experience that someone present knew considerably more about Mr. Wendell's final hours than they were prepared to admit. The sound of the village church bell striking the half-hour drifted through the open window, its familiar chime seeming to emphasize the uncomfortable reality that had settled over the Bluebell Hotel. Somewhere among this small gathering of ostensibly respectable people stood someone who had decided that Mr. Wendell's planned departure should be made permanent in the most final way possible. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, her pale blue eyes moving thoughtfully from face to face. The pattern was beginning to emerge, though still faintly, like a watermark held up to the light. Mr. Wendell had been frightened enough to pack his belongings and settle his accounts, yet something or someone had prevented his escape. The question now was not whether he had been murdered, but which of his fellow guests had possessed both the opportunity and the desperate necessity to ensure his silence forever. Sergeant Abel commandeered Mrs. Partridge's small office for his interviews, establishing himself behind her writing desk with his notebook open and his pencil sharpened to a determined point. The room, normally a sanctuary of domestic order with its neat ledgers and carefully arranged correspondence, had taken on the austere atmosphere of an impromptu courtroom. Miss Marple, invited to remain nearby for Mrs. Partridge's comfort, settled in the adjacent sitting room, where the partially open connecting door allowed her to continue her knitting while remaining discreetly within earshot of the proceedings. Mr. Pendleton entered first, his usual air of commercial authority somewhat diminished by the morning's events. He seated himself with rigid formality, as if proper posture might somehow elevate him above suspicion. "Now then, Mr. Pendleton," Abel began, consulting his notes with official gravity, "what can you tell me about your relationship with the deceased?" "There was no relationship, Sergeant. I barely acknowledged the man's existence. We exchanged perhaps 3 words during my entire stay. Good morning, and excuse me when we passed in the corridor. I am here on business, not to socialize with fellow guests." Pendleton's voice carried the clipped precision of someone determined to minimize his involvement, yet this morning you were observed pacing the terrace in considerable agitation, checking your watch repeatedly. Witnesses say you appeared to be expecting someone. A slight pause, barely perceptible, but Miss Marple's experienced ear caught the hesitation. "I was expecting a business associate who failed to appear for our appointment. He telephoned this morning to cancel. You may verify this with Mrs. Partridge if you doubt my word." "And where were you between midnight and 3 o'clock this morning?" "Asleep in my room, naturally. I heard nothing unusual. I had taken my customary draught for sleep, business pressures, you understand, and I rest quite soundly when medicated." After Pendleton's dismissal, the Hargreaves were interviewed together at Mrs. Hargreaves' tearful insistence. She could not possibly face such an ordeal alone, she declared, clutching her husband's arm with white-knuckled desperation. Their account emerged in nervous, overlapping fragments: early retirement, nothing heard during the night, no acquaintance with the deceased. "Though I did observe him Monday evening," Mrs. Hargreaves added suddenly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "From our window, he was by the garden gate, arguing quite intensely with someone. They seemed most agitated." "Could you identify the other person?" "Too dark, I'm afraid, but it looked decidedly furtive, all that glancing about. Arthur said I was being melodramatic, but now it seems I was quite right to be suspicious." Her husband shifted uncomfortably. "Margaret tends toward the theatrical, Sergeant. I'm certain it was merely a business discussion." When Miss Trent entered, she brought an air of brisk competence that contrasted sharply with the previous nervous testimonies. She seated herself with the composed bearing of someone accustomed to facing difficult situations with practical efficiency. "I understand you knew Mr. Wendell professionally," Abel began, having clearly done some preliminary investigation. For the first time, Miss Trent's composure wavered slightly. "We worked for the same firm some years ago, Pemberton and Associates in London. When I discovered he was staying here, I thought it might be useful to discuss certain business matters. However, he made it quite clear he wished no contact with me." "When did this conversation occur?" "Sunday evening. I approached him in the lounge, and he was, well, quite rude, actually. Told me to leave him alone, that he had nothing to say to me. I respected his wishes thereafter." After she left, young Elsie appeared at Abel's summons, wringing her hands nervously. "Begging your pardon, Sergeant, but I thought you should know. I saw Miss Trent slip something under Mr. Wendell's door Monday afternoon, a note of some sort." This revelation sent Abel hurrying back to question Miss Trent, who admitted to sending a brief business inquiry but claimed it had gone unanswered. Meanwhile, Miss Marple had positioned herself near the garden window, where she observed the Hargreaves in urgent, whispered conference by the rose bushes. Mrs. Hargreaves was weeping openly, and her voice, though hushed, carried clearly in the still air. "He knew, Arthur. He knew everything about what happened in Bournemouth." Her husband's response was a sharp hiss of warning, his eyes darting fearfully toward the hotel windows. When Mrs. Partridge joined Miss Marple with a fresh pot of tea, she confided another detail that had been troubling her. "That letter Mr. Wendell received earlier this week, the handwriting was most distinctive, back-slanted with peculiar little hooks on the letters. I've been trying to place where I'd seen it before." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused momentarily. She had observed Miss Trent making notes in her diary that very morning, and the handwriting had indeed been neat, precise, and notably back-slanted. The pattern was emerging with increasing clarity. Mr. Wendell, a man with dangerous knowledge, had been approached by someone from his past, someone desperate enough to silence him permanently on the very night he had planned to escape. The question was no longer whether he had been murdered, but which of his fellow guests possessed both the means and the compelling necessity to ensure his secrets died with him. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her pale blue eyes thoughtful. The obvious suspect was beginning to emerge, just as they always did in such cases. But in her long experience with human nature, the obvious suspect was rarely the complete answer. There were still threads to be untangled, and she suspected the final pattern would prove more complex than Sergeant Abel's methodical interviews had yet revealed. By early afternoon, the atmosphere at the Bluebell Hotel had settled into the peculiar tension that follows violent death. Sergeant Abel had established himself in Mrs. Partridge's office, methodically reviewing his notes while awaiting Dr. Haydock's preliminary findings. The enforced confinement had begun to tell on the guests, each of whom found themselves trapped not only within the hotel's walls, but within the increasingly uncomfortable web of their own secrets. Miss Marple had positioned herself in the small sitting room adjacent to the office, ostensibly helping Mrs. Partridge restore order to the household routine. Her knitting needles moved with steady precision as she worked on a new project, a sensible grey scarf, while her pale blue eyes observed the subtle drama unfolding around her with the attention of someone who understood that human nature, under pressure, inevitably revealed its true character. Dr. Haydock emerged from his consultation with Abel looking decidedly grim. He paused to speak with Miss Marple, knowing from long experience that her insights often proved more valuable than formal police procedures. "It's confirmed, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "Cyanide poisoning administered sometime between midnight and 3 this morning. The curious thing is the delivery method. We found traces in a small glass tumbler by his bedside, but the cocoa that Elsie delivered, still in its proper mug on the tray, was completely untainted." "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured, her needles never pausing. "So whatever Mr. Wendell drank that killed him, it wasn't his usual bedtime cocoa. Someone brought him something else entirely." "Precisely. And there's another detail that troubles me. When we examined his packed suitcase more thoroughly, we discovered his personal hip flask had been tampered with. The brandy inside was heavily laced with the same poison. It appears someone wanted to ensure he wouldn't survive his journey, regardless of when he chose to take a drink. This revelation cast the crime in an entirely different light. Miss Marple thanked the doctor and continued her quiet observations, noting how each piece of information seemed to deepen rather than clarify the mystery. Someone had gone to considerable lengths to ensure Mr. Wendell's death, preparing multiple methods of delivery with cold, calculated precision. Mr. Pendleton had emerged from his room several times, each appearance marked by increasing agitation. He carried a small leather document case and made repeated attempts to convince the young constable to allow him passage to London, citing urgent business matters that could not wait. When these appeals failed, he retreated to his room with the defeated air of a man watching his world collapse around him. Through his door, the sound of frantic telephone calls could be heard. Hushed, urgent conversations that ended abruptly whenever footsteps approached in the corridor. The Hargreaves had sequestered themselves in the small conservatory, where their whispered arguments continued with mounting intensity. Miss Marple, while arranging flowers in the adjacent hallway, couldn't help but overhear fragments of their conversation. Mrs. Hargreaves' voice, thick with tears, kept returning to something about Bournemouth and what he knew about that summer. Her husband's responses were sharp, warning hisses about keeping quiet and not making things worse than they already were. Miss Trent maintained her composure with admirable determination, working through a stack of business correspondence in the lounge. Yet, Miss Marple observed how frequently her pen would pause mid-sentence, how her gaze would drift toward the garden where Mr. Wendell had held his mysterious evening conversation. When young Elsie passed through with fresh linens, Miss Trent started so violently that she knocked over her teacup, staining several carefully organized documents with Earl Grey. It was while Miss Marple was tidying the corridor outside room 7 that she noticed something the morning's commotion had caused everyone to overlook. The floorboards showed faint traces of what appeared to be spilled liquid, not water, but something slightly sticky that had dried to a barely visible residue. The trail led not toward the main stairs as one might expect, but along the corridor toward the back of the building. More intriguingly, when she bent to examine the washstand in the sealed room through the keyhole, a skill acquired through years of village curiosity, she detected a faint, sweet scent lingering in the air. It was not the harsh chemical odor one might expect from poison, but something altogether more domestic and innocent. Lavender, perhaps, or some similar floral essence that seemed oddly out of place in a commercial traveller's temporary lodgings. "Most curious indeed," she murmured to herself, straightening with some difficulty. In her long experience with human nature, she had learned that the smallest details often proved the most significant. A man who travelled light and lived simply would hardly carry lavender water, yet the scent was unmistakably present in his room. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Marple settled into her chair by the landing window and resumed her knitting. The pattern was beginning to emerge, though still faintly like a watermark held up to the light. Someone among this small gathering had possessed both the means and the desperate necessity to ensure Mr. Wendell's permanent silence. The question was no longer whether he had been murdered, but which of his fellow guests had been clever enough to prepare multiple methods of delivery while maintaining the perfect facade of shocked innocence. The game, as her dear fictional contemporary might have observed, was indeed afoot. And Miss Marple, with her knitting and her gentle questions and her encyclopedic knowledge of human weakness, was perfectly positioned to see it through to its inevitable conclusion. The evening meal at the Bluebell Hotel was a subdued affair, the dining room heavy with unspoken tensions, as each guest appeared punctually, yet maintained careful distances from their fellow diners. Mrs. Partridge had prepared a simple but adequate supper of roast chicken and vegetables, though the food seemed to hold little appeal for anyone present. Miss Marple observed from her corner table how each person approached their meal with the distracted air of those whose minds were occupied with far more pressing concerns than sustenance. Mr. Pendleton had changed into evening dress, an oddly formal gesture given the circumstances, and his collar appeared uncomfortably tight, causing him to tug at it repeatedly between mechanical bites. His eyes constantly darted toward the windows as if calculating possible escape routes, and when the young constable passed through on his rounds, Pendleton's fork clattered against his plate with a sharp sound that made Mrs. Hargreaves visibly jump. The Hargreaves themselves sat in strained silence, their earlier whispered arguments apparently exhausted for the moment. Mrs. Hargreaves had applied fresh powder and rouge, but the effort only emphasized the redness of her eyes and the tension in her jaw. Her husband consumed his meal with grim determination, pausing occasionally to refill his wineglass with hands that trembled slightly. When Miss Trent entered and took her usual seat by the window, Mrs. Hargreaves stiffened perceptibly and whispered something urgent to Arthur, who responded with a warning shake of his head. Miss Trent herself appeared the most composed of the group, though Miss Marple noticed how she had positioned herself with clear views of both the dining-room entrance and the corridor beyond. Her sensible tweeds had been exchanged for a dark blue dress that lent her an air of quiet authority, and she ate methodically, as if determined to maintain her strength for whatever ordeal might lie ahead. It was during the serving of dessert, a respectable apple tart, that young Elsie provided the evening's most significant revelation. She had been clearing plates with her usual nervous efficiency when she suddenly stopped beside Miss Marple's table, her face flushed with the importance of her discovery. "Begging your pardon, miss, but I've remembered something that might be important about Monday night, when Mr. Wendell had that visitor at the garden gate." Every head in the dining-room turned toward her with varying degrees of alarm and interest. Sergeant Abel, who had been taking his own meal in Mrs. Partridge's office, appeared in the doorway with his notebook already in hand. "Go on, child," he encouraged. "What did you remember?" "Well, sir, I was up late Monday evening because my tooth was aching something fierce, and I went down to the kitchen for some oil of cloves. That would have been around 10:30, I reckon. When I passed the back hallway, I saw someone coming in from the garden, someone from inside the hotel, I mean. They were wearing a dark coat with the collar turned up, and they moved quick-like, as if they didn't want to be seen." "Could you identify this person?" Abel pressed, his pencil poised expectantly. Elsie's face crumpled with frustration. "That's just it, sir. The corridor was dark and they had their back to me. But I did notice one thing. They were carrying something small and square wrapped in brown paper. And when they passed, under the wall, sconce for just a moment, I caught a glimpse of their hands. They were wearing gloves, sir, fine leather gloves, the indoor kind. Seemed odd for a warm September evening. This detail produced immediate reactions among the assembled guests. Mr. Pendleton's face had gone pale, and he pushed back his chair with a scraping sound that set everyone's teeth on edge. Mrs. Hargreaves clutched her napkin to her mouth, as if suppressing a cry, while her husband's wineglass paused halfway to his lips, forgotten. Miss Trent remained outwardly calm, though her knuckles whitened where they gripped her dessert fork. Miss Marple set down her own fork with gentle precision and addressed Elsie in her mild, grandmotherly manner. "My dear, you mentioned the person was coming in from the garden. Are you quite certain they were returning to the hotel, not leaving it?" "Oh, yes, miss, quite certain. They were heading toward the main stairs, not away from them." "And this brown paper package, approximately what size would you say it was?" Elsie considered carefully, holding her hands apart to demonstrate. "About so big, miss, the size of a small book, perhaps, or a medicine bottle wrapped up proper." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Someone from within the hotel had met Mr. Wendell at the garden gate Monday evening, then returned carrying a carefully wrapped package. The timing was significant. This would have been shortly before Mr. Wendell's agitated state the following morning, when he had paid his bill and prepared for immediate departure, only to deny the conversation hours later. Miss Marple's mind worked with quiet precision, connecting this new information with the lavender scent she had detected in the dead man's room and the sticky residue in the corridor. Someone had been comfortable enough to linger, careless enough to leave traces, yet calculating enough to wear gloves and wrap their deadly package in anonymous brown paper. As Sergeant Abel dismissed the guests to their rooms with strict instructions that no one was to leave the premises, Miss Marple observed how each person carefully avoided looking at the others, as if eye contact might somehow reveal the guilt that one of them surely carried. The evening had brought them closer to understanding the mechanics of Mr. Wendell's death, yet the final revelation remained tantalizingly out of reach, hidden behind the careful facades of people who had learned, through necessity or desperation, to conceal their deepest secrets. The night brought no peace to the Bluebell Hotel. Miss Marple, finding sleep elusive, had positioned herself in a comfortable chair on the first-floor landing with her knitting, ostensibly seeking better light from the corridor lamp for her delicate stitchwork. In reality, her pale blue eyes missed nothing of the subtle drama unfolding in the shadows around her. The enforced confinement had begun to tell on everyone, and she had learned long ago that people under pressure often revealed their true nature in the small hours when they believed themselves unobserved. Shortly after midnight, the soft creak of a door announced the first nocturnal wanderer. Mrs. Hargreaves emerged from room 5, wrapped in a silk dressing gown, her face ghostly pale without its usual cosmetics. She moved with the careful steps of someone trying to avoid detection, clutching something dark against her chest as she headed toward the back stairs. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm, but her attention sharpened considerably. A few minutes later, Arthur Hargreaves followed, fully dressed save for his collar, which hung loose around his neck. His movements carried the desperate urgency of a man whose world was collapsing around him. After he disappeared down the corridor, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and followed at a discreet distance, her soft slippers making no sound on the carpet runner. The voices drifting from the small conservatory were hushed but intense, carrying clearly in the still night air. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could hear without being discovered, her conscience eased by the knowledge that murder investigations sometimes required unconventional methods. "They'll find out about Bournemouth," Mrs. Hargreaves was sobbing. "Arthur, he recognized me that first day. I saw it in his eyes, all these years of paying him, and now—" "Keep your voice down," her husband hissed. "We agreed to one final payment to make him go away. I never intended for it to go this far, but Margaret, if they find those letters you kept—" "I destroyed them," she whispered frantically. "Burned them in the fireplace tonight. But what if he kept copies? What if there are records?" Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing understanding. The Hargreaves had been victims of systematic blackmail, paying Mr. Wendell to keep silent about some scandal from their past. Yet their obvious terror suggested they were more concerned with concealing evidence than with having committed murder. As she prepared to withdraw, another figure appeared in the corridor behind her. Miss Trent moved with purposeful stealth toward Mrs. Partridge's office, carrying what appeared to be a small, dark object. Miss Marple waited, then followed once more, her curiosity thoroughly aroused. Through the partially open office door, she observed Miss Trent searching through the desk drawers with methodical precision. When she withdrew an envelope from the bottom drawer, her face showed unmistakable relief. But before she could examine its contents, footsteps announced yet another arrival. Mr. Pendleton appeared in the doorway, still fully dressed despite the hour, his document case clutched tightly in his hand. "Looking for something, Miss Trent?" he asked quietly, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "I might ask you the same question, Mr. Pendleton," she replied, straightening with the envelope pressed against her chest. "Wendell kept records," he said wearily, sinking into a chair. Records of everyone he was bleeding dry. I came to destroy evidence of my business arrangements with him before the police discover them. The confrontation that followed revealed the full scope of Mr. Wendell's blackmail operation. Miss Trent admitted to years of payments over accounting irregularities at their former firm. Pendleton confessed to embezzlement that Wendell had discovered and exploited. Both had been trapped in an endless cycle of payments to preserve their reputations and livelihoods. When Mrs. Hargreaves appeared, drawn by the voices, the final piece of the blackmail puzzle fell into place. Her tearful confession about the Bournemouth scandal completed the picture of Mr. Wendell as a systematic extortionist who had been methodically destroying lives for financial gain. Miss Marple stepped into the candlelight, causing all three to start violently. "I believe you should all return to your rooms," she said gently. "Sergeant Abel will want to hear these confessions properly recorded in the morning." "But surely one of us killed him," Miss Trent said, her composure finally cracking. "We all had motive enough." "Indeed you did," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "Yet I'm quite certain none of you actually murdered Mr. Wendell. You see, a blackmailer's victims might wish him dead, but they rarely kill him. They're too afraid of what might come to light if he dies. No, whoever poisoned Mr. Wendell wasn't trying to escape blackmail. They were trying to prevent him from revealing something far more dangerous than financial indiscretions or social scandals." As the three guilty parties retreated to their rooms, Miss Marple remained in the corridor, her mind working with quiet precision. The obvious suspects had revealed themselves, confessing to motives that seemed compelling, but ultimately inadequate. The real killer remained hidden, having allowed others to incriminate themselves while maintaining a perfect facade of shocked innocence. But Miss Marple had noticed something during the confrontation, a fleeting expression of satisfaction on one face when the confessions began, quickly suppressed, but unmistakably present. The game was approaching its final moves, and Miss Marple was beginning to see the pattern that had eluded everyone else. Tomorrow would bring the moment of truth when careful observation and gentle questioning would finally expose the calculating mind behind Mr. Wendell's carefully orchestrated death. The morning brought an unexpected development that would reshape everyone's understanding of the case. Dr. Haydock arrived early, carrying a telegram that bore the official seal of Scotland Yard, his usual brisk demeanour replaced by something approaching bewilderment. He found Miss Marple in the small sitting room, her knitting needles moving with their customary steady rhythm, though her pale blue eyes held the particular alertness that suggested significant revelations were at hand. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, drawing her aside from the other guests who were taking their breakfast in subdued silence. "We've had word from London about our Mr. Wendell. It appears that gentleman has been dead for over 2 years, killed in a motor accident near Guildford, properly buried and documented." Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment. "How very interesting, Doctor. So our victim was not Mr. Wendell at all." "Precisely. Scotland Yard believes he was actually one Harold Pike, a confidence trickster with a particular talent for assuming the identities of deceased persons. He specialized in blackmail, using his false personas to insinuate himself into communities where he could discover and exploit secrets. This revelation cast the entire case in a dramatically different light. When Sergeant Abel gathered the guests to share this information, the reactions were immediate and telling. The three confessed blackmail victims, Miss Trent, Mr. Pendleton, and the Hargreaves, showed obvious relief mixed with confusion. They had been paying to protect secrets from a man who was himself living under a stolen identity. "But this changes everything," Mrs. Hargreaves whispered, clutching her husband's arm. "If he wasn't really Edmund Wendell, then how did he know about Bournemouth? How did any of this begin? Miss Marple, who had been listening with quiet attention, spoke gently. I suspect, my dear, that Mr. Pike, for we must call him by his true name now, was quite skilled at research. A man assuming a dead person's identity would necessarily become expert at discovering information about the living. Your secrets were probably uncovered through careful investigation, rather than personal knowledge. Abel consulted his notes with growing frustration. This means our victim was a professional criminal who made his living by systematic extortion. Any number of people might have wanted him dead, people we know nothing about. Not necessarily, Sergeant, Miss Marple observed, her knitting resuming its gentle rhythm. You see, there's something rather particular about this case that suggests our murderer was indeed someone present in this hotel. The method chosen, poisoning both a drink and a hip flask, required intimate knowledge of Mr. Pike's habits and immediate access to his room and belongings. She paused to examine a particularly intricate stitch before continuing. Then there's the matter of that lavender scent I detected in his room. Mrs. Partridge uses lavender water throughout the hotel, but Mr. Pike had specifically requested minimal housekeeping. Someone brought that scent into his room deliberately, most likely to mask other odours, perhaps the bitter almond smell that Dr. Haydock detected. Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. The killer was trying to cover their tracks, literally and figuratively. Indeed. And there's another detail that has been troubling me considerably. Young Elsie mentioned seeing someone return from the garden Monday night carrying a brown paper package. But she also observed that this person was wearing fine leather gloves, indoor gloves, she specified. That suggests someone who was concerned about leaving fingerprints, yet comfortable enough in the hotel to move about freely after hours. Miss Marple's gaze moved thoughtfully across the assembled faces. Each person present had demonstrated guilty knowledge of something, but she was beginning to discern a different pattern beneath the obvious motives of the blackmail victims. The curious thing about professional blackmailers, she continued in her mild conversational tone, is that their victims rarely kill them. Oh, they may wish them dead, but they're far too frightened of what documents or evidence might surface after the blackmailer's death. No, when a blackmailer is murdered, it's usually by someone who faces exposure of something far more serious than financial irregularities or social embarrassments. The room had grown very quiet. Outside, the grey morning light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the gravity of Miss Marple's words. Someone in this room, she said with gentle certainty, recognized Harold Pike not as Edmund Wendell the blackmailer, but as someone from their own criminal past, someone who couldn't afford to let him live long enough to expose an identity that had been carefully constructed over years. The blackmail victims provided perfect cover. So many people with obvious motives that one more wouldn't be noticed. Miss Marple set down her knitting and folded her hands. Tomorrow, I believe, we shall discover exactly who that someone is. The pattern is nearly complete now, and patterns, in my experience, have a way of revealing themselves when one knows precisely where to look. The remainder of that day Miss Marple spent in what appeared to be the most innocuous of occupations. She settled herself in the lounge with her knitting and a book of crossword puzzles that Mrs. Partridge had thoughtfully provided, creating the perfect image of an elderly lady passing time during an unfortunate delay. Yet her pale blue eyes missed nothing as she orchestrated what she privately considered a most necessary experiment in human psychology. "Such a puzzling clue," she remarked to Miss Trent, when the latter passed through the lounge. 7 letters, one who assumes another's place. I keep thinking it should be imposter, but that's 8 letters, isn't it? Miss Trent paused, glancing down at the puzzle with professional interest. Perhaps stand-in would fit. though that seems rather modern for a traditional crossword. How clever of you, dear. Stand in, yes. It's remarkable how some people can step into another's life so completely that even those closest to them never suspect the deception. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm as she spoke, but her observation of Miss Trent's reaction was acute. The woman's composure remained intact, though her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her handbag. Later, when Mr. Pendleton emerged from yet another frustrated telephone conversation with his London office, Miss Marple beckoned him over with an apologetic smile. "Do help me with this one, Mr. Pendleton. To eliminate evidence of wrongdoing, 6 letters. I thought perhaps delete, but that seems so terribly modern." He studied the puzzle with the desperate air of a man grateful for any distraction from his troubles. Efface, perhaps, or simply cover. That would fit the space. Cover, yes, how interesting that you should think of that particular word. It reminds me of a case in our village where someone went to extraordinary lengths to cover their tracks, using scents to mask odours, wearing gloves to avoid fingerprints, even burning evidence in fireplaces. Quite methodical, really. The Hargreaves, when their turn came, proved equally illuminating. Mrs. Hargreaves, still fragile from her nighttime confessions, started visibly when Miss Marple innocently inquired about a clue relating to partnership in crime. Her husband's protective hovering and sharp warnings about not saying too much revealed the depth of their shared guilt, yet also their genuine bewilderment about the actual murder. It was during the afternoon tea service that Miss Marple's most significant observation occurred. Mrs. Partridge appeared with the tea tray, her usual efficient bustle somehow different, more careful, more controlled. As she bent to arrange the cups, Miss Marple caught the unmistakable scent of lavender water, stronger than the hotel's usual light fragrance. "Such lovely lavender water you use throughout the hotel, Mrs. Partridge," Miss Marple commented pleasantly. "It quite reminds me of my dear friend in Little Wickham who used it to mask the scent of her husband's medicinal preparations. Quite strong medicines they were, bitter almond smell, most unpleasant." Mrs. Partridge's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she poured the tea. "I've always believed in keeping things fresh and pleasant for the guests, Miss Marple. One never knows what unpleasant odours might accumulate in a hotel." "Indeed. And you manage everything so efficiently, my dear. The keys, the supplies, the night rounds. I imagine very little happens in your establishment without your knowledge." When Mrs. Partridge retreated to her kitchen with unusual haste, Miss Marple continued her knitting with quiet satisfaction. The pattern was becoming clear now, like a watermark held to the light. Harold Pike hadn't been killed by his blackmail victims. They were too frightened of what might emerge after his death. No, he had been eliminated by someone who recognized him from a shared criminal past, someone who had built a new life that Pike's continued existence threatened to destroy. As evening approached, Miss Marple made her way to Mrs. Partridge's office under the pretence of helping with correspondence. There, among the neatly filed papers, she discovered what she had been seeking, a telegram dated 3 years prior, forwarded from a London address and bearing the name G. Hayworth. The connection was finally complete. George Hayworth, the solicitor who had vanished with his client's trust funds, had not disappeared alone. Someone had helped him, someone who had used their share of the stolen money to purchase and renovate the Bluebell Hotel. Someone who had lived quietly and respectably for 3 years, until Harold Pike walked through the door and recognized a former partner in crime. Miss Marple carefully replaced the telegram and returned to her knitting. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, the moment when careful observation and gentle questioning would expose the calculating mind behind Mr. Pike's death. The murderer had been clever, using the blackmail victim's obvious guilt as perfect camouflage, but they had underestimated the power of human nature to reveal itself under pressure. As she settled into her chair for the evening, Miss Marple reflected that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most respectable, most helpful, most concerned with others' welfare. Tomorrow she would prove that even the most carefully constructed new identity could not entirely erase the stains of the past. The morning brought a grey, persistent drizzle that seemed to mirror the oppressive atmosphere within the Bluebell Hotel. Miss Marple appeared for breakfast, wearing an expression of quiet anticipation, as if she were looking forward to resolving a particularly challenging crossword puzzle rather than exposing a murderer. Her pale blue eyes held that particular brightness that Dr. Haydock had learned to recognize as the harbinger of uncomfortable revelations. Sergeant Abel had arranged for everyone to gather in the sitting room at 10 o'clock sharp, a request that carried the weight of official authority despite his obvious deference to Miss Marple's superior understanding of the case. The assembled company arranged themselves with the careful spacing of people who had grown profoundly uncomfortable in each other's presence. Miss Trent sat rigidly by the window, the Hargreaves huddled together on the settee, and Mr. Pendleton clutched his document case like a shield against further exposure. Mrs. Partridge moved about the room with her usual efficiency, arranging fresh flowers and adjusting cushions with the determined cheerfulness of someone maintaining normal routines in decidedly abnormal circumstances. Yet Miss Marple observed how her movements had acquired a brittle quality, like porcelain under stress. "You know, Sergeant," Miss Marple began conversationally, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm, "this entire tragic affair reminds me so vividly of a situation we encountered in St. Mary Mead some years ago. A most respectable woman, a shopkeeper's wife, who had built herself an entirely new life after a rather unfortunate past. She was so very careful about the important things, you understand. Changed her name properly, destroyed all the old photographs, even altered her appearance somewhat." Mrs. Partridge paused in her flower arranging, though she continued to face away from the group. Miss Marple's gentle voice carried clearly through the hushed room. The curious thing was how she was eventually discovered. Not through any dramatic investigation, but because her former associate, a man everyone believed dead, walked into her shop one perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning. He recognized her immediately, of course. Partners in crime, you see, develop quite intimate knowledge of each other's habits and mannerisms. "Most interesting," Sergeant Abel said, following Miss Marple's lead, with growing understanding. "What happened to this woman?" "Well, that was the tragic part," Miss Marple continued, her needles never pausing. "She couldn't simply pay him to go away because he wasn't interested in money. He wanted to resume their partnership. When she refused, he threatened to expose her new life entirely. So she did what desperate people often do. She eliminated the threat permanently." Mrs. Partridge's hands had gone very still among the flower stems. The silence in the room had acquired an electric quality, as if lightning might strike at any moment. "The fascinating detail," Miss Marple added, thoughtfully, "was how she tried to cover her tracks. She used her knowledge of the building, she had keys, you see, and her understanding of his habits. She even wore gloves to avoid fingerprints and used strong scents to mask unpleasant odors. But she made one crucial error." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes lifted to meet Mrs. Partridge's reflection in the window glass. "She forgot that when one is terrified, one's hands shake, and when hands shake, liquids spill. The police found traces of the poison she had prepared, leading from his room to her private quarters." Mrs. Partridge turned slowly, her face composed but deadly pale. "That's a very dramatic story, Miss Marple, but I fail to see its relevance to our current situation." Don't you, my dear?" Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, almost apologetic. "I was rather hoping you might help Sergeant Abel locate a particular roll of brown wrapping paper, the sort young Elsie observed Monday evening. I suspect it might be found in your office bureau, along with a pair of fine leather gloves that would still carry traces of bitter almonds." The careful mask of efficiency finally slipped from Mrs. Partridge's features, revealing something desperate and cornered beneath. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the flower table, and for the first time since the investigation began, the unshakable proprietress of the Bluebell Hotel looked genuinely afraid. "You've been very thorough, Miss Marple," she said quietly, her voice carrying the hollow tone of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around her. "I suppose there's no point in maintaining the pretense any longer." Mrs. Partridge straightened slowly, her careful mask of hospitality finally slipping to reveal something far more complex beneath. When she spoke, her voice carried the weariness of someone who had lived too long under the weight of carefully constructed lies. "There's no point in pretense now, is there?" she said quietly, sinking into the nearest chair. "You're quite right about the brown paper and the gloves, Miss Marple. They're in my office bureau, exactly where you said they'd be, along with the telegram that started all this trouble." She looked around the modest sitting room she had furnished with such care, her eyes lingering on details that spoke of years of honest effort. "I was Grace Hayworth once, wife to George Hayworth, the solicitor who disappeared with his client's trust funds. Everyone believed George acted alone, but Harold Pike was his partner from the beginning. They planned it together, split the money 3 ways." Miss Marple's needles continued their gentle rhythm as the confession unfolded like a flower pressed too long between pages, finally revealing its true colors. George took his share and vanished to South America. Pike disappeared into his various false identities. And I used my portion to buy this hotel, to build something decent from the wreckage of my former life. I changed everything, my appearance, my manner, even my handwriting. For 3 years, I believed I had succeeded. Mrs. Hargreaves made a small sound of distress, but the revelation had shifted the entire atmosphere. Their own guilty secrets suddenly seemed far less consequential. Then Pike walked through that door calling himself Edmund Wendell, and I knew immediately. He recognized me just as quickly. That first evening he came to my office and told me we would resume our partnership. He'd been blackmailing the others for money, but from me he wanted something different, a permanent base of operations where he could continue his schemes indefinitely. Her hands trembled as she continued. "I refused, of course. I told him I'd built an honest life and wouldn't return to criminality." He laughed and said he'd expose everything, my past, my identity, the source of my money, everything I'd worked for would be destroyed, the police, the newspapers, the village gossip. It would never end. "So you decided to end him instead," Miss Marple observed gently. "Monday evening I met him at the garden gate with that bottle wrapped in brown paper. I told him it was a peace offering, a gesture of goodwill while we negotiated terms. I wore gloves because I knew about fingerprints, used my lavender water liberally to mask any chemical odors. I even doctored his hip flask when I brought his evening cocoa just to ensure he wouldn't survive long enough to carry out his threats. Yet he packed his belongings and paid his bill," Sergeant Abel noted, consulting his notes. Mrs. Partridge's smile was bitter, "because I convinced him that Sergeant Abel had been making inquiries about a confidence trickster in the area. I suggested he check out officially, then return quietly once the authorities lost interest. He believed me because it sounded like the careful planning he himself would employ. He died thinking he'd won, that I would help him destroy more lives." Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded Mrs. Partridge with something approaching sympathy. "You see, Sergeant, this is why I knew our murderer wasn't among the blackmail victims. People being blackmailed live in terror of exposure, but they rarely kill their tormentor. They're too afraid of what might surface after his death. But Mrs. Partridge faced something far worse than embarrassment or financial ruin. She faced prison, the complete destruction of an identity she had spent years creating." As Sergeant Abel led Mrs. Partridge away, her dignity intact despite the circumstances, the remaining guests sat in stunned silence. Their own secrets, which had seemed so overwhelming, now appeared almost trivial by comparison. Dr. Haydock shook his head as he watched the police car disappear down the lane. "How did you know it was her, Miss Marple? The others all had such compelling motives." "That was precisely the problem, Doctor. Their motives were too obvious, too perfectly suited to deflect suspicion elsewhere. But Mrs. Partridge possessed the three essential elements the others lacked: intimate knowledge of the hotel's routines, complete access to Mr. Pike's room and belongings, and most importantly, a past that couldn't withstand any scrutiny whatsoever." Miss Marple gathered her knitting with a small sigh. The guest who checked out before he died had finally settled his account in full. Justice, as it always does in my experience, had prevailed through careful observation and an understanding that the most dangerous criminals are often those who appear most respectable, most helpful, most concerned with maintaining proper appearances. The Bluebell Hotel would pass into other hands, but Miss Marple reflected that beneath the surface of the most ordinary lives often lay depths of desperation that could transform even the most genteel proprietress into a calculating murderer. Human nature, in all its complexity, remained her most reliable guide to the truth.